Welcome to the Fat Tony's Podcast, where we bridge the gap between everyday life and expert insight. Join us in conversation with real-world experts, gaining practical advice and strategies to navigate the complexities of the modern world.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Fat Tony's podcast. I'm your host, Seb Lees. Today's guest is a children's author with a fascinating past in the world of insights and analytics. For over a decade, she's helped organizations make sense of their data and, in her own words, driven thousands of decisions and unlocked millions of dollars of value for billions of companies in trillions of ways. But now she's turned her talents to storytelling. Not about the data we do see, but the stories data doesn't tell. She's the creator of the Jane and FIFO Adventures, a series of picture books that introduce kids to supply chain and operations concepts in a fun, approachable way. She's also the author of the Corporate Elements Mysteries, a cozy mystery series for millennials that explores the balancing acts between life and work. And today, she's here to talk about, amongst other things, her latest release, Max, Entropy and the Avalanche, a new story that promises adventure, insight, and a fresh take on uncertainty. Megan Preston Meyer, it's an absolute pleasure. Welcome to Fat Tony's.
Thank you, Seb. I'm glad to be here.
So the softball obvious question is, working in a corporate environment, analytics, data, consulting, and then moving to children's author. That's an interesting journey. Could you tell us a little bit about the background of that journey, what prompted it, and how you made that transition?
Sure. If we were going to go way to the beginning, if you had asked me when I was 8 years old what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have said an author. But when, where I was growing up, when I was growing up, you couldn't just be an author. So I went to college, I got an MBA, I went into the business world. And I wrote on the side my entire life. I've been writing, but I never really, that was a hobby, and work was work. And I got into analytics, and so I started out in supply chain and then moved more towards pure analytics. And I really enjoyed it, but I realized what I really liked about it was the kind of the communicating the insights. Like the data part was fun, but that was sort of just the table stakes. I had to find out something from the numbers that was worth telling people. But I liked the telling people part a lot better. And so the arc of my career moved more and more towards communication. And then one day I decided, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to take a year out of my corporate career, try to become a writer, see what happens. And I figured after a year, if it really didn't work, I could brush off my CV and get back into the corporate world. And that was 5 years ago. And so far I'm still, not on anybody's payroll. So we'll see how long I can keep this up.
Wow. That's fantastic. I think it's so relevant there. There's this kind of modern idea that you sort of go into these traditional careers and then doing something for fun cannot be work. Yet historically, that wasn't the case at all. And we've had this separation of concern in modernity, and I think we're sort of finding our way back to that old way now. And I totally get it. I think there's also that element of sort of build a safety net up first, something that brings home the bacon, and then experimenting what Taleb, I suppose, would call extremistan, these extremistan environments where you can go for it. And I think as well, it's an interesting segue because some of these ideas are also talked about in your books. And I couldn't help noticing in your latest book, Max, Entropy and the Avalanche, a lot of these concepts are related to ideas of previous guests that we've had on this podcast. Emmanuel Derman, for example, with his book Models Behaving Badly, which talks about the flaws and dangers when we rely too heavily on models. And obviously concepts of Nassim Taleb, which almost all listeners of this podcast will be familiar with. Did those ideas influence you with this, or is that a happy coincidence?
I think that's a hard question because I mean, I wouldn't say that I read something else and then decided, okay, I didn't set out to write a Taleb book for kids, I guess. I didn't take these concepts and say, how am I going to, put them into a fun little story, make it rhyme, and then try and, teach 6-year-olds these concepts. But I've definitely been influenced. I mean, this is something, this idea of uncertainty, the faults in models, the difficulty of prediction, and resilience. I mean, these are things that I've been thinking about for a long time, both in my corporate career and since then. And so I'm sure it's, there's nothing new under the sun. And especially as a writer, this is one of the things that you have to come to terms with very early on, is that you aren't coming up with anything original ever. You're just stating it differently. And so I think I've just stated it a little differently.
I think it's really novel doing this kind of thing as a children's author, because I've got to say, I don't think I've ever seen these kinds of concepts communicated in a children's book before. And you say there's nothing new under the sun, but I do think this is a really novel new approach to it. And there's something wider I wanted to talk about a little bit later, which is related to why, certainly in the British education system, we don't at school kind of teach these life skills, teach these principles. But before that, before we get too ahead of ourselves, I wanted to ask specifically about being a children's author. Writing for children is a craft in itself. And it's one of those things that looks deceptively simple, but is in fact incredibly difficult to do. How do you balance simplifying what can be very complex topics without dumbing them down, but making them accessible to children?
That's a good question. And that's not one that when I started out, I hadn't actively thought about it. And now that I look back, I've tried to sort of fit reasoning to what I've done. But I think the key to any sort of communication, whether it's to kids, whether it's to adults, is give people just the amount of information that they need. And I guess also keep in mind how many more times they will be exposed to this message. And I think the really nice thing about writing kids' books is that it is not my job in 24 pages to explain the entire world of supply chain or the entire concept of uncertainty. It is to bring the awareness to the concept, bring in a couple of terms so that kids can start building the vocabulary. So when they hear these concepts repeated again, they'll be able to recognize it. And then other than that, don't try to overload any single story, any single book, any single message with too much detail. And so that trust that kids will hear this stuff again. They will, they'll learn it. And if they have if they can say, oh, that's like supply Jane and FIFO, or, oh, that's like max entropy, then they'll start being able to add more and more layers on top of layers until they get a good understanding of the entire concept.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. The kind of reinforcement of education, and so many of the mental models we learn growing up. We start off with the idea, and then it's almost like layers of an onion. We build it up a little bit. High school physics, we learn the model of the atom, and then you go to college and you learn, well, actually that's not quite true. It's a little bit more advanced. So we build up our perception of the world. And it's absolutely fascinating. I was talking to, I can't remember who it was, but a previous guest on this podcast, when we were talking about how storytelling has this fractal element to it, in that you can have a story and you could make a 9-hour film trilogy out of that story, or you could make a 5-minute parable out of that story. And that 5 minutes parable would still maintain 95% of the essence of the moral or the concept of the film. So it have this enormous compression algorithm to it, for want of a better word. That's my software side coming out, where it's almost like we've evolved as storytellers, or I personally believe we evolve as storytellers because it has this amazing ability to compress information. And the oldest, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm going to have a listener tell me I'm wrong here, but I've heard about Aboriginal storytelling And there are stories that have been passed down for 6, 7, 8,000 years now. And we originally thought they were myths. But now we're finding geological evidence that backs up that these stories are a form of oral history telling that are preserved all these years later. So I think you're absolutely right on that. So I still love how novel a concept this is. And I know on the flip side, you've got your young children's stories, and then you've also got your corporate elements mysteries. That's another niche that I didn't really know about actually until just before this interview. But they're described as cozy mysteries set in corporate environments. Could you tell me a little bit more about those?
Yeah. And one thing so most of the things I write are very niche. I heard one time a long time ago some advice that said niche down and then niche down again. And I've taken that seriously. Whether it's led to success or not is another story. But that, if you're going to write kids' books, make them about supply chain management. If you're going to write cozy mysteries, that's a fairly big genre of literature. Those are the mysteries where there's not a lot of blood and gore described. There's not a lot of swearing or sex most of the time. So they are just, I think Agatha Christie sort of created the genre, and then Murder, She Wrote, the TV show, that's kind of the canonical cozy mystery. And now they're becoming more modern because the cliche is that they're all about little old ladies wearing cardigans, in a tiny town in Maine that has a death rate of like 40 people per 100 but they're becoming more modern. And I decided I was going to get into this genre. Well, no, I can't even say that. I didn't decide I was going to get into this genre. I wrote a book and it happened to fit into this genre. And Firebrand, the first in the corporate elements mysteries, it's sort of semi-autobiographical. It's about a girl who gets her MBA and her first big corporate job and then has to solve a mystery. And so I didn't have to solve a mystery, at least not a mystery like my main character has to solve. But a lot of the trappings of the book are just there. It's more about corporate absurdity than the plot, really. And so I kind of I just wrote that book and then sort of found a genre to slot it into.
I think this is quite serendipitous when you're talking about cozy mysteries becoming more modern. Just last night, me and my partner were watching a series called Poker Face, which I think kind of reinvents the Murder, She Wrote concept for a modern audience. And it's exactly that, lady who travels around solving a murder everywhere, happens to stumble upon it, but written for a new generation. And I think the slight twist is she has this superpower where she can tell if someone's lying. And I swear we're not sponsored by this, but it's well worth watching. And you're right. And I was an absolutely enormous Agatha Christie fan growing up. Had all the books, really, really loved those books. And again, corporate absurdity. Yes, I think we all have been there many, many times. I think we could do a whole podcast on why corporate absurdity exists and why we tie themselves into those knots. So let's talk a little bit about Max Entropy now, Max Entropy and the Avalanche. So this is the latest book that's being released. Is it early June? Have I got that right?
It's actually the on sale date is May 20th. But one of the nice things about being an independent publisher is that no one will know about it until I tell them about it. So it's kind of on sale when I start marketing.
When it does go on sale, we will put the confirmed date, obviously below this on all of our different platforms, and we'll also put a link to it. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, and without giving too much away, again, what inspired it, what it's about, and anything you want to mention about it, really?
Yeah, this one is it's not part of the Supply Chain series, and it's aimed at kids. It's fully illustrated. I worked with the same illustrator, that Aneta Amersdorfer, that I've been working with on all the Supply Chain books. But this one is a little more. There's a lot more or I guess there's equal amounts for adults and kids in this book, I would think. And it's also I don't want to oversell it or say that there's layers and layers of deep philosophical meaning, because the read time is about 3.5 minutes. So it's not, it's a fun little story. It rhymes, and it follows the story of two little boys. One is named Max Entropy. He gets the title billing. And then his friend is named Predict Sean. And Max Entropy and Predict Sean tend to look at the world in different ways. They come at it from very different perspectives. And the story follows the boys as they wake up on what they think will be a snow day off from school, and turns out a little differently than probably either one of them expected.
I don't want to give too much away, but however, you say it's not overly philosophical, but I found a lot of layers to unpack on this. And maybe it's just because I'm a huge Taleb nerd, but I immediately, with the two main characters, started thinking of the kind of Nassim Taleb, Nate Silver feud, for want of a better word. For those who don't know, Nate Silver is, I wish, is it 538, the kind of prediction company he founded? It's a 3-digit number, and he shot to fame by claiming, I think, having a very high accuracy rate of US election forecasts. And now he's grown that into a cottage industry of prediction. And Taleb has always been quite wary of anyone in the prediction game, but Nate Silver especially. And they've had some very interesting discussions, arguments. Definitely not suitable for children, but really interesting if you want a maybe slightly more adult version of this theme before you buy the book and read it to your children. I love framing the Avalanche as a concept for this, because it's just, like you say, it's taking these complex topics and distilling them and just making them accessible to children. And children love snow. Absolutely love snow. And, snow days are one of the most vivid memories of my childhood, actually. I'm showing my age here, but being huddled around the hi-fi, the radio in the living room, and waiting to hear if my school was on the list of schools that's going to be closed that day. And the absolute joy of, the school's closed because there's too much snow, and then you go and play all day. So I think that's a really emotional, resonating thing for kids. And when I read it, the first thing I thought of, in the UK, for people of a certain age, there is an extremely famous incident with a very famous weather reader called Michael Fish, who in 1987 went on one of the main networks, and there was warnings about a storm coming to the UK. And he went on and was super confidently telling everybody in the country not to worry. There's going to be no storm. There's no danger. Nothing's going to hit. It's going to divert. You don't have to do anything. And then, of course, that didn't happen at all. I think the storm claimed 18 lives. It caused £1.5 billion worth of damage, and it just absolutely destroyed the country. It was a hurricane. And this is played so often, this famous clip now, even to this day, as a kind of parable about the dangers of confidently over-predicting very chaotic things like the weather. So when I read this, that's the first thing I thought of. And I think a lot of British people of a certain age will find that. But I'm going to include a YouTube link to that clip for non-British people as well, because I really love it.
Okay. Yeah, I've never heard of that story, but I wish I had. I will be the first person to click on that link.
It's one of those things, he's a goofy guy, he's got a crazy 80s tie, but back in the day, he was kind of like the UK weather version of Walter Cronkite, I guess. It's the best way to describe it to American listeners. And he just totally fluffed it. And again, going back to what we mentioned earlier, I think it's really, really important to teach these kind of ideas to kids, because certainly in the UK, schools don't. And we have a very, what I suppose I would call traditional curriculum here. You do learn maths, you do learn these sort of things, but you learn them in quite an abstract, non-real world way. We learn about percentages and compounding, but we never have a lesson on the importance of mortgage interest rates and how to understand what you're actually paying back and things like that. So Did that come into play at all when you were thinking about this? And what are your experiences in, I guess, the American education system? And do you think we need more of that?
I think, yeah. So I'm a product of the American education system. I live in Switzerland now. And so I don't have kids, but I know enough I know kids and I know enough about the Swiss education system. I don't know much about the British system, but I think, I think that I don't want to say we're doing a disservice to kids. That's very strong language. But the things that I learned, Saba, it's just like you described. I learned more, not pure mathematics, but mathematics sort of in a vacuum. And then I learned, then we would learn science in a vacuum. There was very little sort of cross-disciplinary focus, very little, emphasis on actually using some of these concepts in the real world. If you could fill out a worksheet, or if you could get enough right answers on a test, that was good enough. There's the meme about, we don't know how to do taxes, but we know that mitochondria is the powerhouse of a cell. And I think so one of the really nice things about the Swiss system is that there's not so much of it's not a single track, everyone is funneled into the same route. So in the US, like where I grew up, when I grew up, the expectation was that I would go to a liberal arts college and then probably get a master's degree. And I think that right there, just having that expectation that, that every child is going to follow that track and end up in sort of a white collar, like knowledge job. That's not realistic. And even if it was, we would still, there would still be implications on, on how the education system should work, because it doesn't seem like it when you're in school, but the vast majority of your life is spent outside of school in the real world. And so we should probably be focusing more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing about being in a vacuum, you're right. I remember growing up, it felt, looking back, you don't realize it, but looking back, it's very much about, can you demonstrate knowledge of this? Yes, we've ticked that box. Do the paper, do the exam, move on. And then you kind of forget 90% of it within a few years. And there's very little cross-pollination of concepts and ideas. And of course, the whole root of innovation in the real world is cross-pollination of ideas and concepts and finding new ways to use different things. So it's almost like we're taught in a vacuum convex to what happens in the real world. And there's an essay by Paul Graham, who was the founder of Y Combinator, Startup Accelerator. And he talks about how high schools, when you look at them in a historical perspective, are really, really bizarre, because for thousands of years, what you would have is apprenticeships or learning where you would have young adults, adolescents in an environment with people of all age groups. They'd be talking to 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 20-year-olds. And so they'd learn through being around those people and that exchange of wisdom. What we do now is shove a bunch of prepubescent and puberty hormone-driven teenagers into one room together, and we get this Lord of the Flies kind of clique system where you have the popular kids and the nerdy kids and all of this, and it's just such an abnormal environment for a teenager to be in. And really, that has come about because of modernity and almost because we have 9-to-5 jobs as a kind of daycare to a certain extent, not necessarily because that's the best way for young adults of that age to be learning concepts.
Yeah.
What I love is your books try to address this. And obviously, again, I've mentioned it, but this element of taking mediocre STAN ideas and talking about things like non-linearity, complexity, entropy, certainly a little bit of entropy as well in max entropy. I suppose if I'm going to segue a little bit, of all the children's books you had growing up, I certainly know there's nothing like this, but there's anything that you loved growing up that had a direct correlation or influence to this, or something, or a children's book that exists today that in your research has influenced you on this?
So when I was growing up, I loved the Berenstain Bears, and I'm not sure if those, if UK readers would be familiar with those, but it was a series of books. There's probably 20 of them, 30 of them. There were so many, and they were on very specific themes. The Berenstain Bears go to the grocery store. The Berenstain Bears go, go to work. The Berenstain Bears do this and do that. But they were all very, they were bears and they were talking. So they weren't, it wasn't completely real world, but they were always doing real world. They were in real world scenarios, doing real world tasks. And they were, I didn't think of it as such when I was a kid, but I loved the variety. And then there's also another one. I don't know if I read this when I was a kid or I've just discovered it more recently, but Richard Scarry's Busy World. I probably should have, it would have been around when I was younger, but that's another one where there's just, there's so much going on. The illustrations are very busy. There's cars zooming everywhere. There's apartment buildings, there's stores. And I think something about just the variety and the kind of the magnitude of activities, those always really appealed to me because that's what life is like. I mean, life is not like we were saying about the education system. It's not this contrived sort of very sterile institution where, it's put together in a certain way more for the convenience of society than for any real function. And life is messy and chaotic and busy and fun. And I think that's the message we should be giving to kids.
Yeah, I agree. And I think kids kind of intuitively grasp that. I mean, it's almost trained out of them through your 12 years of education or whatnot. There's a couple of things I want to pick up. Firstly, you mentioned heavily illustrated, and I know your books as well are heavily illustrated and you have a partnership there. Was that something you decided upon from the beginning, or is that something that evolved throughout the course of developing the idea of children's stories?
When I first came up with the idea for FIFO Saves the Day is the very first Supply Jane and FIFO adventure. And I can't draw. I wouldn't have been able to do it justice. And so I knew from the beginning I needed an illustrator. And so I went on Upwork and I was very prepared to have, every single page I would have kind of sketched out. Here's what I think should happen, sort of the storyboard, and then just have someone clean it up for me. But I found Aneta and I very clearly saw that she was probably, she is such a professional. She's so gifted, and things that I would never have thought about, she was able to bring through in illustrations. And I mean, it was so nice to kind of realize, hey, I don't have to dictate where every single, what every single page is going to look like, and to let her do her magic, because then it really, when I see the drafts of the illustrations, I get surprised too. And it's always really nice to be surprised by kind of your own project, your own work. So
that's amazing. I do love the illustrations, I've got to say. And I am a visual person anyway. I've always been a visual person. And even as a software developer, I imagine processes in visual ways. So anything that's heavily visual sucks me in straight away. I want to ask a little bit about, I suppose, talking a little bit more about your own corporate experiences. And I know, you still do corporate work, you still do some consulting work as well. I think I saw on your website. If that's a little bit out of date, let me know. But has this process of being a children's author and writing about some of these concepts and corporate experiences allowed you to distill and grow in your own experience in the corporate world? Have you derived insight through going through this process?
That's a good question. closest I get to corporate work these days is it's more on the communication side. So I don't do nearly as much, analytics or insights. But I think one thing that I have taken just from, whether it's from being an author or just being outside of the corporate environment for a while is I have a wider perspective on it. And it's, at first I left and I was like, oh, the corporate world, everything is so backwards. Everything is so, like people are so, absurd. I mean, like it's just, it doesn't make any sense. And, oh, these poor people who are in there still stuck in the rat race. And then I sort of chilled out a little bit and I realized, like it is a strange environment. A lot of corporations, a lot of larger organizations do put people into these unnatural situations where there's competition and there's hierarchy and there's, you act differently at work than you do outside of work. Almost all of us do. And that's, like I think I've been able to be a little bit more accepting of it, I guess. And so, like you go into it and if you put on your corporate voice and you go and you put on your corporate persona and get your job done and then go away, that's okay. There's, as long as you don't lose yourself in the corporate persona. And I think that's part of the danger we see sometimes we hear these big decisions coming out of huge multinational companies. And I think a lot of people have sort of lost their outside of work personas. And and then you get lost in the absurdity and you make absurd decisions. And if they're at a large enough scale that it affects the rest of us, then there's a danger.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting thought. The idea of putting your corporate mask or work mask on, absolutely. I think everybody does that. And I think that's a kind of unspoken trade-off. We mediate ourselves so that we can work together in large groups. I think one of the phrases that was doing the rounds a few years back was bring your full self to work or whole self to work.
Yep.
And I remember thinking that's a terrible idea because if everybody did that, everybody would hate each other and you would not be able to collaborate and get everything done because we're all so different. We all have our own neuroses and quirks. And the whole idea is to leave those behind so we can collaborate. And it does create a slightly artificial environment. I do think that has got worse over the last 30 or 40 years. Maybe I'm just glamorizing, but I've consulted for quite a few large financial institutions. And when I speak to some of the old guard about the way it was in the 70s and the 80s, yes, it was bad in 100 ways. You only need to talk about, sexism and all sorts of horrible things. But it does feel like there was more soul and personality to these environments, which maybe the trade-off we've made is that they're now more egalitarian at the expense of being a little bit more soulless. But whatever the reason, I think it is important not to just dismiss them as, oh, this is crazy or backwards, or at the end of the day, again, going back to some of the concepts, I think some of the wider concepts that you talk about and Taleb talks about is this idea of black boxes. And these things evolve and work in a way that are multidimensional and that we might not understand at a surface level. So they may look bizarre and crazy, but they've almost evolved to work that way, and they do work, and they make billions of dollars for the respect to it, and they generate huge amounts of wealth. So I think you're right. I think there's that perspective. When you're in the thick of it, it can feel like you're living in a madhouse. And I've said that several times to my partner. And yeah, I think taking that step back, you can have a bit more of a long view, a slightly more distant view of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that I have learned that is probably it's probably the most important thing I've learned, and one of my least favorite things to have learned, is that nothing is black and white. And you can just not make any blanket statements. And even, like I understand the irony of saying you can't make blanket statements, but work is not bad or good. It just is. And I mean, you can say that about almost anything. And there are, like you said, there's always trade-offs. And it's just a matter of sort of finding your own spot on the spectrum and saying, I will be exactly this soulless for money, but no more. Or I will be exactly this, absurd, or I will be exactly this competitive and sort of turn off the more human side of me to rise to this pay grade. And after that, I'm done. So it's finding your place on the spectrum, setting your boundaries, but also realizing that, for most of us, setting a boundary so far as to say, like, I'm not going to play the game. Like, that's not realistic. Most of us have to play the game to some extent. And if you can play the game and not be, like, if you can just if you can be okay with the game that you're playing, if you can understand the rules and just say, all right, it is a game, but I'm going to play it. I think that made me a lot happier, and hopefully that can help others.
That's really interesting. I think when I've had my darker moments being in these kind of environments, reminding yourself it's a game, reframing it in that way is really interesting because, basketball is absurd on the surface of it. When you think about that, people being paid millions of dollars to throw a ball around a square, but the rules of the game. And that's really, really interesting. I love that. Reframing it as a game. It sounds simple, but I suppose like all great simple ideas, it's something I've never fully thought about before. I love that. So I suppose talking about ideas simple ideas that I'd not thought of before. Have you ever had an adult come to you, maybe after reading one of your books to their kids, who hadn't thought about some of the concepts you talked about before and said, oh, this is fantastic because I learned something from this too?
I have, actually. And so a lot of the kids' books, a lot of the supply chain books are, parents who are in the supply chain field buy them. And so they already have some ideas. And that's sort of the standard flow where a parent reads it to their kids to sort of impart their knowledge they have to their child. But I also have a lot of people who, that I happen to know and who know me, and they think, oh, wow, like Megan wrote a book. I'm going to get this book. And so then it's kind of the opposite. Well, not the opposite flow, but like the parent also doesn't have a lot of supply chain knowledge. The kid doesn't either. So they're learning together. And that's been neat too, because it's another one of those, I fall into this trap where I assume the things that I know, everybody knows. Like the environment that I'm in, everyone else at least has some inkling of. And so I throw around terms like operations management or logistics or, like inventory. And I assume that that's just common knowledge. And it's not to a lot of people. And so it's been really interesting to see that people who are in, who are nurses or teachers or in completely different fields reading these books and saying, oh, that's cool. We both learned something at bedtime last night.
There's this idea, isn't there, that you just internalize what you do to such an extent that you just assume everybody knows this. And I do this with websites all the time. I get enraged by small things I notice that nobody else would even know or care about. And what's interesting is a lot of the globalized world now runs on this invisible infrastructure, these invisible processes, of which supply chain is one of them. And we had a story in the UK here 2 or 3 days ago about there's a big retail and grocery chain here, Marks and Spencer's, that was hit by a cyber attack. And a third order effect of that is it completely destroyed their supply chain. And I actually missed this news story for whatever reason. And I was in Marks and Spencer's yesterday and I was like, why are the shelves half empty? And my partner said, oh, it's for supply chain disruption. I was like, what? So these invisible processes where you just automatically assume the shelves are full for whatever reason. And then you learn about things like JIT and how that's great in one way, but just in time. Sorry I'm guilty of my own thing there. People know what JIT is. But how it's great in one way, but can introduce weakness when you have these disruptive events. And I also read a book a few years back called The Box, which was about the shipping container industry, which sounds quite dry, but I absolutely loved it. It was a really interesting read, and just this invisible infrastructure and process that just has such a big impact on every aspect of our life. And I wish we had more literature like that exposes these processes to people who, they might not want to do a career in it, they might not want to do a textbook on it, but getting the highlights is genuinely quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And what you're saying, I call this the sort of the hidden logic of the world. And you're exactly right. It's all there, this infrastructure and these processes. And I would argue that it's not invisible necessarily, or it's, when it works, it is, it's just like anything else. It hums along. But one of the things that I love about supply chain and operations and some of these more, like, they're quite tangible disciplines. And I think that's why it works well for kids books, because you can take a kid down to the docks and you can look at these shipping containers. I mean, shipping containers that's a perfect example of something that it's invisible because you see them all the time, or trucks on the highway, or, they're part of the fabric of the world. And so you don't notice them until they're not there, or until, they're spilling or, blocking a canal or doing something that you don't want them to do. But if you take the time to kind of look at a dock, look at a truck, look at, the back room, kind of peer into the back room at a grocery store, you can see a lot of this stuff in motion. And I think that can make it, it can be quite tangible and concrete, as opposed to, Seb, I could not be a coder. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I find is, invisible infrastructure, like all of this more abstract kind of ones and zeros. And we need, but it's so funny what you say too about how now everything is so intertwined that a cyber attack can make it so you can't fill your grocery order.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I suppose there are three things I want to pick up before we run out of time. And the first one was about this, what my friend Gerald Ashley would call a kind of over-connected world, and how everything now is becoming more intertwined, so that these third order effects, these cascade failure situations, as I call them, are becoming more and more prominent. It seems like there isn't really, every couple of months there's something. I think the last time we met up in Chicago, there was the CrowdStrike outage, which caused, global flights to go down. So a few of us couldn't make it. And I think what's interesting is by exposing these processes to kids early on, and especially in your new book, using the avalanche as a kind of metaphor for these things and the dangers of prediction, we're just getting those concepts in early. Now, when I read this, I wanted to ask you, so the two characters in this book, they're sort of the polar opposites of each other. And we talk about one as, I suppose, obviously entropy, non-linearity, the dangers of forecasting, and the other one being the more, I suppose, what you call classic non-linear scientific approach. Was the idea that they are two distinct characters? Because part of me read it as how we both have this side of us in our brain, these two kind of ways of looking at the world, and they're doing battle with each other sometimes, and we have to tame one or the other depending on what kind of environment we're in and mediating it. Am I overreading this, or how are you looking into it that way?
No, I don't think so. I think you're exactly right. And I was very careful to not make a good guy and a bad guy. I didn't want either one of them to be clearly right and the other one clearly wrong. Obviously, there's a little bit of a bias and kind of, like maybe 60-40, 70-30, kind of which way you should lean. But I think we, just like you say, we have both, and we need both. I mean, we need to be rational and logical, and we need to, we can't just be completely chaotic and just, see how the wind blows. We need to do some prediction, we need to do some planning, but we also need to be resilient and just and robust enough to, whatever happens, to not get so sort of paralyzed by being wrong about our prediction. That was one thing I learned in the corporate world, is that you will never be right. I mean, anytime you're predicting, you try to be less wrong. And I mean, that's not a great, just not a great mode to live in. Your, the kind of highest aspiration is to be less wrong. But I think having this idea, especially for kids, that you will be, make your best guess, do your due diligence. But when you're wrong, pick yourself up and start, figure out what you're going to do next. I think that's good for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think we can be guilty on this corner of Twitter of being a little bit overzealous about, models are terrible, models are bad. But we were talking with Emmanuel Derman, and he was saying the point isn't that models are bad. Models are good and models are useful. It's about understanding the limitations of the models you create. And that's where the balance lies between the two characters in your story. And I love, going back slightly, but one thing I forgot to mention is you were talking about invisible infrastructure. And what I love is kids go through these phases, like they go through their train phase, they go through their truck. It's very, very common. So being able to hijack that phase, that very common phase, like, yeah, these are trucks, but like, look at the layer beyond this. I think that's a really nice way. I don't want to say of sneaking it under the radar because that sounds a bit Machiavellian, but it's a really nice way of introducing those concepts to kids. Right, I'm mindful of time as always on this show, so I'm going to move on to kind of what I call the lightning round, which is very quick questions from community members, people who listen to the show but they might be interested in asking. They're not super long answers, so please don't worry. And as always, you never know we've had some wild and wacky questions from people in the past. So let's see what we've got. If Max Entropy had a theme song, what would it be?
I can, like, a little jingle just came into my mind. I don't know what it is. It might be the A-Team theme song. I'm not sure.
Was it in 2005? A statistical modeler was in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Okay, great. So, supply chain hero, cozy mystery sleuth, or children's author, which is the most fun to write?
The cozy mysteries are the most fun to write just because half of it is like a diary. Like when I write those, most of the job is editing out the things that no one is going to care about except me. But I think that's the most fun.
Okay, moving on. Let's have a look at these. Let's pick one that's slightly different. So I suppose going back to your wider experience, what would you say is one of the most underrated or misunderstood concepts in operations management or supply chain management?
Good question. I think it's kind of misunderstood by other people. And this is, any insider is going to say, well, the people who work in supply chain know all of the concepts. But I think there is this, a lot of times operations management, supply chain, because it's so tangible, it's kind of the limiting reagent. And you can't make things go faster. You can't, you're still held by the laws of physics a lot of times. And whereas in many other disciplines or other functions, you can kind of change a slide on a PowerPoint and make a big, actual change. You can't do that a lot of times in operations. And I think that's misunderstood.
Yeah, absolutely. I think softwares might be a little bit to blame for this, because with software, it can be quite trivial to change things and alter things. The cost is negligible. And so the kind of agile movement that's grown up in software of ship fast, break things, constantly iterate on fast cycles, I've seen that bleed into other areas as a management fad or management trend where it's maybe not appropriate, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Shipping fast does break things sometimes in the real world.
And, you can't just roll out a new release and it updates automatically. There are real world consequences of that. And again, this is coming back to Taleb's idea of skin in the game, where the Victorian railway engineers would have to sleep under the bridges with their family for the first few nights they're operational, and mechanisms like that. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, which was, So, what's next for you after the Avalanche? Do you have, to expand on that question a little bit, the way I read this is, do you have a kind of arc planned for these characters? And do you have different arcs in the pipeline? Or are you taking it one book at a time?
This one, I'm taking one book at a time. I don't have another book planned. I have some ideas, but this book, the entirety of the story and like most of the like final form of the text took about 20 minutes start to finish. So it was very sort of, I was inspired. I wrote it down. And so if I get, if I am inspired for another Max Entropy and Prediction story, I will, I at this point, there's no way to know. There's like, I can't predict if there's going to be another one. So we'll all just see.
Wow, I look forward to seeing. Well, I think we're just about running out of time, but I suppose before we wrap up, is there anything else you wanted to mention? Any shout outs? Anything you want to shamelessly plug? Anything at all, really, you wanted to mention?
I mean, shameless plug for the books. A lot of the conversation has been a shameless plug for the books, but The Adventures of Supply, Jane and FIFO, read them to your kids. Firebrand, read it yourself. Max Entropy and the Avalanche, all of you can read it together.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. It's been absolutely brilliant conversation. It's been really intriguing to be able to frame a lot of the ideas that I love, that this community loves, through the lens of children's books. I think it's an absolutely brilliant idea. I think it will resonate strongly with the members of this community who do have kids, who love these ideas. And yeah, I look forward to seeing more. But for now, I'll just say, Megan, Preston Meyer, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming to Pat Tony's.
Yeah, thanks so much, Seb. This has been wonderful.